Hi everybody, it's Amy and Maggie and we're back with
Hello.
another episode of Shelfworthy, and this time we have our first big Euro game. It is Saltfjord, which is a game that made a lot of people's Game of the Year back in 2024, and we have not been able to find it in Australia, so now we've had a good chance to play it. In case you don't know, this game is actually a reimagining of an older game, Santa Maria, but now with a much more palatable theme.
Yes, now in Saltfjord, we find ourselves in the start of the 20th century in a Norwegian fishing village. And we are tasked with expanding the village by constructing buildings that we're going to be able to recruit and send our workers to. We're going to be able to send our ships down the fjord to do some fishing and get some resources, and also be able to, dip our toes a bit into trade. Ultimately, whoever gets to create the most prosperous village will be the winner.
Now, this game has a mechanic that we both quite like, which is dice drafting. And in this game, you're going to be drafting two different colors of die. So there's orange die and white die, and they are going to activate your private little grid of buildings. So depending on which color you take, orange will activate a row and white will activate a column, and then the number of pips will determine which row or column it activates. Now, when you take a die from that central drafting space on your turn, you're going to slide it along that row or down that column, and you're going to activate every building along the way. When you reach the final building, you're going to leave that die there, which means that die is now on your puzzle and in the way, and you can no longer activate that building. Now, you're going to have to be activating these buildings to get different resources that you need and to get things done out on the main board. But the tricky thing is that you need resources to build more buildings to put onto your map so that each die is more powerful. You're able to also upgrade some technologies which are going to enable you to have better and stronger actions throughout the course of the game. But the real meat of the puzzle is that throughout the 3 rounds of this game, you're only going to be drafting 15 die, which means you have very limited turns and actions to get everything done. Throughout the course of the game, you're going to be collecting victory points along the way, but then there's always some variable end game scoring conditions that you can unlock if you get to the top of the tech tracks, and the person with the most victory points will be the winner of the game. Now, this is one of those games where the more you play it, the more you realize how challenging this puzzle actually is.
Yeah, I think actually the biggest thing, or the first thing that hit me about this game, is that core puzzle of that grid activation with the movement of the dice and the columns and the rows. It is actually quite engaging and quite interesting to be like, oh, wait a second. Okay, so what are the dice available that I'm going to be able to have access to? And then wait a second, the dice and the columns and the rows don't actually have enough buildings. So how do I kind of sequence this out to try and put more buildings in there so that when this dice come into town, it can actually get a lot of things done.
Yeah, and I think I speak for the both of us when I say that didn't really unveil itself until later games. So on the first game, this game is actually really easy in terms of rules overhead.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty mid-weight level game. It's easy to learn and teach, but the optimization of the puzzle and the challenge of getting a high score, that's where the tension comes in. And for that reason, if you've played a game like Tapestry, it reminds me of that. The turns themselves not that tricky, but if you want to optimize the order in which you do those in order to get, this kind of cumulative effect going with a small number of actions, that's where this puzzle really shines. But when I first played it, I was like, this seems too simple and not that interesting. So the first game I was kind of like meh, but the more games I played of this, the better it got. And another reason why that is because we started at the higher player counts with this game.
Yes, you definitely have this sense of there's a lot that I can try and figure out in my turn, which can create a lot of downtime when you're playing at the higher player counts, which is why a lot of times you kind of hear that, this is probably better at the lower player counts. Bit of a spoiler alert, I loved it at the lowest possible player count. But yeah, I think that's one of the challenges.
Yeah, so one of the things I felt when playing this game is I felt quite lonely. And if you watch the channel, you'll know that I like high interaction games, and this game is very low interaction. And that is why people prefer this game at a lower player count. So once we started, we'd played with some friends, once we started playing it at 2, that's when I realized actually this is really nice. And it's nice for a couple of reasons at 2. It's not just because there's less downtime, but that certainly is part of it. But I found myself getting like a little less bored because, in the time that I'm thinking about my next turn, Maggie's just taking her turn, which are pretty snappy generally. They get longer towards the end of the game, but pretty snappy. So then it's my turn and I have to play. So there's less of that downtime time feeling. But the other thing is that in this game, you're a little bit at mercy of what gets rolled on the dice. So there's a group of dice that get rolled, and so you're going to know what's available to you. You can mitigate that by using the fish resource to change the pip value on the die. But for the most part, you're trying to work within the constraints of what's been rolled. And in a 2-player game, you can puzzle that out much better. So you can be like, well, there's so many 3s there that I know, Maggie can only take 1 on her next turn. So there's definitely going to be 1 left over for me. So I know I have at least, a couple of turns to get something else done that I wanted to before I take that die. So that allows you more agency over your puzzle, because the true beauty of the puzzle is really in building as many buildings as you can before you need to take a die and activate that row or column.
Yeah. One of the things as well with this game was I actually came into the game with fairly high expectations, because I actually really liked the aesthetic, and I was like, oh great, fishing and resources, it sounds right up my alley. And then when we started playing, I was like, actually this isn't hitting as much as I thought it would. Probably because actually when you play it, it actually plays a lot more abstractly than like, oh yeah, probably the fishing is the most thematic element, and even that I wasn't finding as satisfying as I was kind of going through it. Now, when I was playing it solo, I was actually then pleasantly surprised that I enjoyed it. It's sort of like, okay, I enjoy this a lot more. One, because I get very, very bored. I love multiplayer solitaire, but I get very, very bored with the downtime while I'm waiting for the turn to come back around. The solo, didn't have to do that. But also I had all of the freedom and a lot more control, because then none of the dice is one of those very streamlined implementations of a solo, which I love. There's no automa to facilitate, and you're essentially kind of allocating these die that then will also sort of block some of the end actions, but then you're just drafting from that pool of die, and no one is going to take those away. So I was able to kind of plan things better, really kind of optimize things, and yeah, it just was a much more, it's still abstract, but much more enjoyable experience.
There were actually 2 things that surprised me about this game. One was when I first read the rule book, I was a bit concerned that the resource conversion and just using like boring little blocks to represent a resource of each type, and not having cute little fish and cute little things that we generally really love. I was like, oh, here we go. But that is buttery smooth. The idea of converting and upgrading different resources and then downgrading them to fish again, I actually really rate that part of the puzzle. I think it's really, really clever, and it works so well in practice, and it means that it's not slowing anything down. Looking at you, Hallertau, which has a similar mechanism, but lots of different resources that make it really fiddly in the upgrade, moving things around. So actually, that I really liked about the puzzle, and I was surprised by it. Now, the other thing that I was really surprised by is there's not a ton of variability in this game. There's a little expansion that you can add. There is, if you turn the player boards over, there are asymmetric different starting positions. It doesn't make too much of a difference. But the key thing that changes are those variable end game conditions at the end of the tech tracks. And that alone, combined with having a slightly different starting ability, and you can get an additional personal ability as well along the way, those things alone, because you have so few turns in this game, it means that your strategy becomes very focused. And I really liked that about the puzzle. And I was surprised by just those little tweaks that I was like, okay, you know what? Everything is aligning. I need to make this a fishing game. And so I need to upgrade my boat, and I need to work on that part of the game, because you can't do everything in this game. And when you're building out your little puzzle of action tiles, you can actually try and choose the action tiles that are going to enable you to get that strategy done.
Actually, on that, what I'll say is I found that actually in the solo, there's more refreshing of that pool of buildings. There's a bit of a refreshing mechanic, which means that then you can probably see more tiles than you do in the 2-player game if the person that you're playing with is not kind of optimizing that part, which can actually feel a little bit limiting, because if you want, like, I have a tendency to go, I really want to try this particular avenue, but sometimes you really can't if the buildings are not coming up that will allow you to expand or add those actions into your grid. So I found that a little bit restrictive at times. Now, in terms of things that I would either change or that didn't really hit as much for me, would be one, as I mentioned before, it plays more abstractly than it does give me that sense of like, thematic immersion. So I would want for it to be a little bit more thematic. Even the buildings are just like, okay, it's just iconography. There's no real rhyme or reason for why, this die is activating this or that. The other element is the variability. So even with the fishing track, or the fishing through the fjord, which is probably the most thematic element, as you're kind of going along, even when you're unlocking technologies that allow you to fish for, more interesting things, it's always just almost like the same 5 different elements in a different variety, but it always just kind of felt a little bit samey. And for the effort that you put into it, because sometimes it can be quite tricky to get to the points that you want, it just, I wish it was more exciting in terms of, what comes through there.
For me, the main pain point with this game is the setup. It is a challenging setup. There are lots of different pieces and it involves a lot of counting out of different tokens, stacking them on top of each other. To set this game up takes quite a long time, especially for the first time. It got quicker as we played it more, but I still found like, oh, here we go again. I've got to set this whole thing up. Now, that leads to a pretty tricky conundrum with this game in terms of, is it shelf-worthy? Because Saltfjord is ideal for us at 1 player, solo, or at 2 players. But then you've got the added element of it takes a lot of time to set up. And so am I going to go through all of that setup? Am I going to keep a box this size on our shelf just for a 2-player game where there's other games in our collection that take less time
like
to set
another
up?
fjord game, like Newsfjord.
Newsfjord.
Which is also fishing.
Yeah.
And it's just like much quicker to sort of set up and get through.
So I want to caveat like my rating and, this being shelf-worthy for us. For me, it doesn't have a place in our collection, but I want to say that I do think the puzzle itself is really, really clever. And if you and your other, you and your key opponent in your life really like 2-player games, and you predominantly play at that player count, and you're looking for a bigger, meatier Euro experience, I can see a lot of people being delighted with this game, especially because there's so many different avenues to go into that puzzle with. So if you don't mind the time to set it up, it's a great game. For me, it's a 7.9. Low interaction is just not my thing, but I can really appreciate the subtleties of the optimization of the puzzle.
For me, it's a 7.5, and largely, again, it's a bit more abstract than I was hoping. The downtime in multiplayer really just makes me bored and almost disengaged, which then makes me not be as good at the game as I could. I did enjoy the solo though, and I agree, it's not a bad game. Like, it's actually quite an interesting core puzzle, but probably not quite enough to make it into our shelf.
So that is our shelf-worthy assessment of Saltfjord. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll be back with more board game content soon. But otherwise, bye for now.
Bye.